Signs and Proofs of God series, video 3 of 16. Scientific proof and evidence, as well as testimonials, prove God's reality and His love for all of mankind. Chapter 3, Signs and Proofs of God series. Near-death experience, scientific research prove God. It does not matter what you feel or what you imagine to be true. What ultimately matters is what the truth actually is. Did you know the average person lives for 28,251 days? Did you know rain contains the vitamin B12? Vitamin B12 gives you energy. Perhaps that's why people are always running through the rain. Those are some interesting facts about life. Now for some interesting facts about what could be the afterlife.
That religion is just absolutely uncalled for. We are just mere things floating on a rock in space.
We are not only figuratively, but literally stardust.
You don't have to go to church on Christmas, and it is about being good, and that's what all religions are about anyway.
Are you an atheist?
Yeah.
Gonna kill yourself?
Yeah, I'd like to.
So you're an atheist?
Yes.
I need to know what to believe in.
Like what happens when you die?
Yes, I don't want to be a bag of dust.
David, are you an atheist?
Yes.
When did you become an atheist?
Around age 12.
Believing in God makes no sense. It's to me, it's the dumbest thing. It's for people that can't accept the fact that they're going to die and rot in the ground like I'm going to do, and it gives them some relief from that thought, because it's not the nicest thought in the world.
Are you an atheist?
Yes.
Yes, I am.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Are you an atheist?
I am.
Yeah, I'm an atheist.
Yes, I am.
Alex, do you believe in God's existence?
No, I do not.
How long have you been an atheist?
I would say probably since I was about 15 years old.
So you don't believe in the existence of God?
No, not really.
What happened when you were 15?
I started questioning things, and I really just started to think about the logic behind everything.
For the most part, we are not shown the evidence for there being a higher power. If we were, I almost guarantee that almost every atheist would immediately agree to there being a higher power.
Are you atheists?
Yes.
Why?
Well, I just haven't seen enough evidence, I suppose. I grew up in a Christian family, and just over the few years during high school and as I grew up, I just realized that there wasn't a lot of evidence to support that belief system.
Are you open to evidence?
I think I am open to evidence. It just would have to be extraordinarily compelling, like out of this world compelling.
If you could be given evidence, reasonable evidence, would you listen to it?
Yeah, I would.
You're someone who has no faith or no belief in a higher power or a creator, but if you were shown evidence, you would change your mind because you're open.
Absolutely.
None of us are really sure of anything that happens after we die.
Oh yeah, I'm absolutely sure, 100%. 54 million people a year die. A lot die young. And if God exists, then there's possibly a way past death. And I'm saying, man, there is. There really is. What you got to do is get to square one and soften your heart and say, okay, this is evidence. I'm no longer an atheist. Tell me what you want to say. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What do you worry about? I mean, if midlife crisis is often like
fear
facing
death.
your own death.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, maybe you'll go to heaven. Maybe you'll die and go to heaven.
Okay, that's I need help.
We're tormented by a fear of death, but we're so proud we don't mention it because it makes us seem vulnerable and weak. It's very rare to speak of this in private, let alone in public.
I need to know what to believe in.
Like what happens when you die?
Yes, I don't want to be a bag of dust.
The best evidence in the world that there is life after death and a supreme being known as God, and details about what that afterlife and God are, comes from the universal phenomenon called near-death experiences.
Hello, my name is Tommy Warren. I'm an independent researcher and U.S. citizen. What I'm about to discuss with you is something that you probably know nothing about, and that's about this phenomenon called near-death experiences. What a near-death experience is when someone either dies or comes close to dying, they have an out-of-body experience during their death, and when they're resuscitated, they tell about what they experienced on the other side. Now, if you're like me, the first thing I thought of when I had heard someone had died and they experienced something that they thought was real was that this was really just a lack of oxygen to their brain and that they were hallucinating the whole thing. However, after just watching a few of these near-death experience testimonies, it becomes clear that there's way more to it than just that, because these stories are actually related to each other. And what you'll find if you watch a ton of these testimonies is that they actually tell the exact same story. So before we take our journey into the afterlife, I want to take a moment to address some important things with you first. Our society today, especially our younger generation, has been socially programmed, or socially conditioned if you will, to always be asking ourselves, how does this make me feel? What I mean by this is when we see, hear, or read something, we're always asking ourselves, does this make me feel good? And if it doesn't make us feel good, then we automatically reject it and move on. However, the reason why this is a flawed way of looking at things is because when it comes to something that's important, what ultimately matters is, what is the truth? For instance, let's take a hypothetical scenario. Let's say, just as a hypothetical, that God is real. Let's say that God created the world, He gave us rules to live by, and that we're going to be judged according to those rules in the afterlife based on how we lived while we're living. So if this scenario were true, we can do what makes us feel good. But if it's not in accordance with the rules, then we're still going to be judged according to those rules. So as you can see, when it comes to something that's important, sometimes it doesn't matter what makes us feel good. What really matters is what the truth actually is, whether we like it or not. And so I've heard people say before, well, I decide where I'm going to go. I control where I'm going to go when I die. I'm going to heaven, or wherever. But here's the flaw with that one. If you do have a soul, can you control where your soul goes right now? Can you make it leave your body right now? You see, the problem is, if you can't control where your soul goes right now, what makes you think you can control where it goes in the afterlife? And so you don't hear people talk about this next point, probably because no one has a good answer or they haven't ever thought about it. But let's just look at the facts. No one knows for sure what's going to happen in the afterlife until we get there. We can have faith, belief, and conviction about it, but we don't know for sure what's going to happen. And here's proof of that. Between the major different religions and the different denominations of each of those religions, There are literally over 10,000 different religions that all say theirs is the only true religion. Well, there's a real problem in the world then, isn't there? Because there are 6.9 billion people in the world today, and even if the biggest religion is correct, the biggest one, which would be the Roman Catholic Church, then that would mean 83% of the world is wrong. 83%! And that's just the biggest one. If you look at most groups of religions, that number increases exponentially. With most religions out there, if they were the true one, that would mean the other 99% of the world is wrong. So here's the problem we're left with. People have conviction. They have belief about what's going to happen in the afterlife. Many people are willing to die for it, or even sometimes kill for their religion. But the fact of the matter is, everybody thinks they're right. But with most of the religions out there, there's over a 99% chance that they're wrong. It has to be that way. Do the math. There's no other way. So my point in telling you this is just to make you aware that there's a very real confusion in the world today. And by definition, no matter how they feel about it, most of the world has to be wrong. So getting back on topic with these near-death experiences, which I'm very excited to tell you about, I wanted to make this movie to share my knowledge about these and to put that knowledge out there because, number one, the majority of the population doesn't even know about near-death experiences, and number two, I've watched so many of them that I certainly feel qualified enough to make a short educational film about the topic. So I'm going to share with you about these experiences, but you don't have to take my word for it. You can check these out for yourself. You can Google them. You can go onto YouTube and search about them and watch these yourself to see for yourself that what I'm telling you is exactly what's out there. In fact, I kind of like it when people try to prove me wrong on this, because what you'll find is exactly what I'm talking about, and you'll end up with the truth.
Chapter 3, Section 1. Who is God? People see a light. What is the source of the light that people experience during near-death experiences? NDE Accounts presents What Happens When You Die.
And the light had no judgment. There was no condemnation. There was no blaming, no shame. There was nothing but love and acceptance. And the light was viewing me. The light knew everything that I ever thought, did, or will do. It knew everything.
You just know. You're all-knowing. Everything is a part of you. It's just so beautiful. It was eternity. It's like I was always there, and I will always be there. That my existence on Earth was just a very brief instant.
This being, who I personally believe was God, or at least a representative of God, if not God himself, communicated to me not the word love, but the understanding of love. It was a love that was total and all-encompassing.
I then became aware of a bright, heavenly being. I felt as if I was in the presence of God. this being of light, this being had light radiating from him, and he embraced me. And when he embraced me, I could feel the most powerful love. It's the greatest love that there is in the universe. There's no greater love. I mean, it was absolutely total, real, great, engulfing love.
The message is clear that we're all here for a specific purpose, and that we are all loved and cherished.
Chapter 3, Section 2. The source of the light comes from God, and the being within that light is described as God. Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, Jews, Christians, atheists, and people from all social, cultural, and economic backgrounds all come to the same conclusion as is stated above.
And then you meet this being of light. People really love that. It's intense love, intense compassion, and they want to stay with the being of light. Then some people will even put a name on it. Some people say it's Jesus. Some people feel that it's a very high spiritual being.
How can you tell anybody what the presence of God is? No religion can do it. No holy book can do it. No article can do it. No novel can do it. It's being there, consumed by that power that is so beyond power that it dissolves identity, it dissolves cells, it dissolves molecules, it dissolves even nakedness, it dissolves everything.
This being was everything there is. There is nothing that you can compare it to. There are no words really to explain what it felt like. This is a space where you do not want to leave, you want to stay there. This is what we all strive to get at.
As I continued to marvel at this and wonder what was happening to me, I started drawing towards this light that had such presence and such love to it. I saw in front of me start to envelop this light that coalesced. Couldn't tell the distance to the light, but it coalesced as a ball. And I marveled at this ball because it was infinite. And it seemed to be the presence I was suspended in that actually took form in front of me. And I spent some time just gaping at this because there was nothing around this ball. This ball contained the universe. Somehow I knew that. And there was nothing, no dimensions, no time, no space, no thing. And it was not something my mind could wrap itself around.
It felt like it was reaching out, and I use the word envelop because it felt like it just surrounded me and pulled me in, like it was reaching out, and it just wrapped itself around me and pulled me into unity, and that's where in that process is where I was connecting to all of my totality of who I really am.
And there before me was the living presence of the being of light. And this being was all-knowing. It knew everything that was going to happen and will happen, and the reasons behind them.
It was just in this beautiful place of existence that just, it was the 0 point. It had nothing, had any meaning.
Very curious about the light. And then this experience starts getting trite because I don't really have the language to describe it.
And I was stepped into the light, and it was so many different colors I had never seen before, iridescent, shimmering, glowing, and the feeling of being in that light was the most incredible feeling I'd ever had. The joy, the peace, the harmony, the okayness, the allowing, the expansion of it all.
And it was, there was a perfect justice, and it also contained all things that ever were or will be. And it was loving me. It was just pouring out this unconditional love at me.
As I got closer to the light, I had this very strong sense of at last I'm home. About that time, the light opened up into the shape of a person, and still radiant light, and I just dove right into it, into perfect love and peace and joy and bliss. An amazing feeling.
What I think happens when we die is that we enter into another state of existence, or another state of consciousness that is so extraordinarily different from the spatial and temporal frame of reality in which we exist in the physical world, that the language we have is not yet adequate to describe this other state of existence or consciousness.
Near-death experience number 6. Avid atheist has a near-death experience of God.
A light exploded under me, a light brighter than a million suns. So this is beyond my vocabulary, especially in describing this light, because it sounds so, oh, the light, yeah.
I was sailing over that dappling path that the sun puts across the ocean, and it felt so delicious. Like, even though I didn't really have a body, I could feel this motion, this swooping, this right over the ocean. The sun got bigger and bigger, and all of a sudden I realized, holy crap, I'm gonna go into the sun. And then, I'm in the sun.
You know what? This light was love.
And it came from this being that was like a parent, it seemed. That seemed to be holding me, cradling me, and loving me like I was an infant or baby, and just pouring, you are so loved, you are so loved. And it felt so good. And I loved the parent so much, but what happened, I didn't see anything, I didn't hear anything. It was just intense, brilliant light, warmth, and love, until I just sort of wasn't even thinking, you love me, I love you. It was just, love is. I told my roommate the whole story, but I was a really intense atheist. I was an adamant atheist. Anybody who's believed in God, talked about God, it just pissed me off. So I told the story, but I used that compartment of mine that I had developed when I was young. And I put the truth that was God or something. I knew it was God or something with that powerful love. Stuck that in the vault. And I would have left it there. I would have left it there as just this weird thing that happened to me that had no meaning, because I'd never heard of a near-death experience. I'd never heard of white light. Except that paranormal after effects started to happen to me. The greatest one was around my sister's death. She was dying of breast cancer. They had told us she had 2 weeks to live. I was waiting in their hospital room, and a voice said to me, "Tell her about the light, she's afraid." And I was like, "No, what? She's gonna live 2 weeks, what is this?" And when I'd close my eyes, I could feel the light starting to fill the room. I could feel the light starting to pool around her body. And I'd open my eyes and look, and these eyes didn't see anything, and I'd be like, "There's nothing there, and she's gonna live 2 weeks," and it just kept building until finally I was like, "Okay, I'll do it." And so I went to her, and I knelt down by her, and I described the light as I remembered it. And I said, "It'll be all around you." She believed in Jesus, so I said, "Jesus will be with you. You'll go with him. You'll be enfolded in his love, and you'll know so much happiness." And when I was done, I went and I sat down, and then 20 minutes later, she hemorrhaged and she died. And then something came from outside, and it was my sister. And she was saying, "I'm fine, I'm great." And then I began to feel her hovering in the hospital room, loving us all with that same kind of love. And she filled me with it. She filled me with the light again.
But the essence of what I'm saying is we've got to conquer the fear of dying. And people who've had these near-death experiences, we are duty-bound to share to people, we don't die. We only move on. We only move on. I wish I could find words. It's a beautiful, 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 beautiful event. It's better than being born.
Chapter 3, Signs and Proof of God, Near-Death Experience Number 4. Lawyer Jeffrey Thompson has a heartfelt near-death experience and talks to God.
My internal clock told me that I was getting ready to die, and I only had a few seconds of consciousness left. I reached up to grab my wife. I was just wanting to tell her how much I loved her and tell her that I was getting ready to leave her.
And I went to him, and it was right after that I lost him. You know, I could tell he left. And he took my hand, and then he was gone.
And my life came to my center torso, and I began to rise out of my body up into that room. Everything was going haywire down below me. They were saying, "I'm going to lose him."
They were doing everything they knew to keep him alive at that point.
It looked like it was a disaster going on, but it was the sweetest day of my life. I never had any pain, and I never had any fear.
As Jeffrey's spirit hovered above his body, a light appeared.
It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. It started in the center of the room toward the ceiling and began to filter out into that room, and I was immediately drawn to it. And as it began to hit objects in that room, color came flooding out like I've never seen before. My senses became enhanced. I could see everything in that room with perfect clarity. There was an entire dimension that we just simply don't see on Earth. I've never been more alive than I was at that moment. It was incredible. I suddenly had an overwhelming sense of God's presence, of His love, of His peace, of His joy. The thing that was just so incredible to me is how the maker of this universe, who can make the sun, the moon, and the stars in this earth and us, can come down and hold me and comfort me and love me as if I'm the only person in the universe. And I remember thinking about the prodigal son. That's what came to mind for me, that long-lost son that had gone out and strayed, and he had come back home. And his father was coming out to hold him and to love him and to welcome him back. That's what was happening to me. It's the sweetest love there is. I told him I wanted to go with him. And then I had a fleeting thought. But what about Madeline, my wife, and what about Will? My sweet wife is just falling apart down below me, and I'd never seen her that way. And I'm up here in complete comfort, in complete peace, in complete joy. And then God told me internally I was going to go back. And I remember jolting in my bed And I opened my eyes, and when I opened my eyes, I'm looking at the surgeon, and he's saying, I'm losing him. We've got to get him back in surgery.
Jeffrey was rushed back into surgery where doctors stopped the bleeding. When he finally regained consciousness, Jeffrey had a new understanding of God's amazing love and presence in his life.
God loves you more than you've ever known. He knows your circumstances. He knows what you're going through. I used to wake up with a knot in my stomach. I wake up with joy in my heart. I know He's with me. You can't go through something like that and not be a changed man.
He has a peace about him. He's a very peaceful and very centered. He's really not fearful of anything now.
Chapter 3, Signs and Proof of God. Section 2 continued. Hindu man meets the being within the light, whom he described as being brighter than 1,000 suns. His wife asked, what happened to all of the thousands of Hindu gods that we believe in? The truth is, there were no Hindu gods, but only the one true living God at the highest level, the light being who was radiating love.
Dr. Party, I'd like to thank you for consenting to this interview.
It is my pleasure to be here.
Okay. Dr. Party, you recently gave a talk at South Bay IANS, your account of your own near-death experience, and I'm wondering if you could talk to us about it now.
Yeah, my near-death experience happened about 3 years ago. It was an experience which changed my life forever. In multiple ways, I became a happier, healthier, and a more peaceful person. And my first reaction as a out-of-body experience was that I was not only present in the operating room, but I could also sense and see my mother and my sister in India. They were sitting in the lounge there, and it was evening time there, and they were having general discussion. My mom was wearing a green sari and a green sweater, and my sister was wearing a blue jean and a red sweater, which after 2-3 days of me getting better, I called and verified it. And in the operating room, I saw myself being cut and the infected fluid coming out, which was very awful smelling. One thing I distinctly remember is the joke told by an anesthesiologist. I can't repeat the joke, but he verified with me in the recovery room that he did tell the joke. I went to the tunnel, and from the tunnel on the other side, I was greeted by 2 young, robust men. They were full of peace but full of strength, and telepathically they told me they were my guardian angels, and they were Raphael and Michael.
If you were brought up as a Hindu, how is it possible that during your near-death experience you encountered 2 angels, Raphael and Michael, 2 Christian symbols being in your near-death experience?
Now, it was very surprising to me being a Hindu, how could the angels showed up? And when I told my wife's first reaction was, what happened to thousands of Indian gods and goddesses? None of them showed up. And from there, I was guided by the angels towards a meadow. The meadow was beautiful with roses of different colors. A clear water stream was flowing, and there was sweet smell to the air. And there was a distant chant which sounded like Om or Ang to be correct, which I later on found was a primordial form of Om. And then as I went higher and higher in the realm, the consciousness became more formless. That's what the angels had told me too, that at the highest level the consciousness is totally formless. And then I found myself in front of a light. The light was like about 1,000 suns blazing at the same time, but it was not hurting the eyes. I felt unconditional love, like I talk about, I could see love, I could hear love, I could touch love, I could taste love, and I could smell love. It was love all around. It's very hard to describe it, but the best word I have come to describe it, the word I felt, was the Sanskrit word Shanti, which means cosmic peace, cosmic harmony, and bliss. And when I was in the presence of the light being talked to me without talking, that my life will be spared. But when I go back, it will be a totally different life. I'll have to give up materialism, maybe give up my career as an anesthesiologist, and be a healer of the soul, especially the three conditions I had suffered in my own life: depression, addiction, and chronic pain, and to help people with these things, three conditions, which I call diseases of the soul. And then I woke up with a jolt in the recovery room.
Chapter 3, Signs and Proofs of God, NDE number 5. Author Crystal McVeigh shares her NDE of seeing God and the light.
The first thing I remember becoming aware of was that I was still me. And I was still the me who had just told my mother that I loved her and died. And I was very aware of the fact that I had just died. But I was also the me that had existed from the moment that God had created me. The light came to me as if I was in the middle of the tunnel, yet it went on for eternity. I remember being so at peace and so bathed in this light and this love.
She knew she was in the presence of God.
I didn't see a face. I didn't see any features other than this beautiful light. And words like amazing and perfect and beautiful, they fall so drastically short. I could not get enough of him. I could not breathe enough of him in. I could not get close enough to the light, and the light was all over me.
Then, Crystal says she tried to ask God a question.
I wanted to know why he didn't love me, or why he lets bad things happen. And yet as I stood in front of him and I faced him and I fell to my knees and I raised my hands, the question I called out to him was, why didn't I do more for you? Because in an instant, he revealed his true self to me, which is love. I had never truly worshiped God ever in my entire life, but I fell in front of him and I worshiped him. And as I lay there in worship and awe of this Creator, I remember saying, I could worship you for eternity.
God revealed to Crystal that she was seeing herself at 3 years old.
She was me at the moment that the enemy stepped into my life and whispered that I was worthless, that I was broken, that I was disgusting, that I got everything I deserved. She was the 3-year-old that heard that God didn't love her, that he had abandoned her, that he had forsaken her, and that God didn't exist. And he allowed me to know that he had allowed me to look through his eyes and to see the truth. And the truth set me free.
All of Crystal's doubts about the existence of God and his love for her faded away.
I remember what it felt like to be in chains. And I remember the moment that he took them from me. I was free, and he didn't just say, Crystal, I love you. He allowed me to experience his love, and his love almost made me explode.
Chapter 3, Signs and Proof of God, Section 2 continued. A Buddhist encounters Buddha in his NDE. Buddha tells this Buddhist that the light he saw, which was very bright like the sun, was coming from God. Buddha gives him a message and tells him to believe only in the eternal God.
I am live from China, and I am a Buddhist from this. I saw a car was coming toward me and hit me at 30 kilometers per hour, and I told I lost my senses. When I opened my eyes, I saw a different world. In front of me, there was 4 angels standing in front of me, They asked me to follow them, and I saw a huge sun in front of me. But I was more shocked to see Buddha standing beside that sun. I asked Buddha, why are you here? What is the sun? Buddha replied, I am here because I must have to be here, and his son is the small part of eternal God. Like I asked Buddha, did you disagree with the experience of ethical God? He replied, yes. Yes, and it was my biggest mistake, and I will punished for his son. Buddha then said, I was called there to show you and tell you about the experience of ethical God. You are not the first one, and many more will be called here to inform about the experience of eternal God. I was confused what to do then. Buddha said, don't be confused. Just go back and believe in eternal God. He asked me to believe in ethical God and make myself free of the punishment he has. When I regained my full senses, I was so happy to be alive, and after that I start believing in Buddha and in eternal God.
The science of near-death research proves God, as explained by Dr. Jeffrey Long.
Dr. Long, now you've written this second book, God and the Afterlife, and even though we've covered a lot of your background here already about your long-time experience with studying near-death experience research, that you're a physician, that you're very careful about it, I gotta tell you, with that title, a lot of people are going to assume this is a religious book. Did you have a religious agenda in this book, with this book?
Absolutely not. My only thought was I was developing the research behind God and the Afterlife book, and the research there was I just wanted to know the truth. I set out with that commitment that whatever I was going to find, I was going to publish, wherever that path would go. To my somewhat astonishment, as I kept digging into experiences, near-death experiences that were aware of or encountered God, I was amazed once again at the consistency of what was being described. I have 277 near-death experiences that either were aware of or encountered God. It's not a small study. So I just really wanted to publish what I found. There's no religious agenda at all with this. And in fact, if you talk to people that encounter God in their near-death experiences, it really seems to be, while it's God, it doesn't seem to be related to their prior religious beliefs. Whatever religious belief they had doesn't seem to affect the probability of them encountering God or what will happen when they do encounter God in their near-death experience. So God seems to be, in near-death experiences, very independent from religion. People are fascinated by this kind of material. They're fascinated by the evidence that God exists. what they've been taught to take on faith, what they've hoped would be true. Now all of a sudden we're saying, hey, we consistently observed God in near-death experiences. Over 200 near-death experiences, all remarkably similar about what people are encountering, about what people share about that later, and the news is amazingly good that they're bringing back.
Okay, let's get to the news. In the book, God and the Afterlife, you asked, during your experience, did you encounter any specific information or awareness that God or a supreme being either does or does not exist? And then you said, you broke it down and said, what did they believe before their experience and what do they believe currently as they're answering the survey? And the choices you gave them were God definitely exists, God probably exists, I was uncertain if God exists, God probably doesn't exist, or God definitely doesn't exist. What did you find out?
I was astounded when I crunched the numbers on that. I was amazed at, especially among people that encountered God, the unbelievable shift from how they would have responded to their thoughts about reality of God at the time they had their near-death experience to later, at the time they were sharing their near-death experience, an average of 20 years later. Virtually everybody that had a near-death experience and encountered God shifted to believing that God absolutely is real, and it responded to that survey question as such. And that's not a surprise now, is it? They were convinced that what they saw was really God. God as with whatever evidence they needed, however they wanted to. They've had years to think about it. They had plenty of time to consider, is this really God or is this really not God? And yet, by the hundreds, overwhelming majority of near-death experiencers that encounter God come away believing, hey, based on my personal experience, I now know beyond a doubt, not on faith, not because somebody told me to believe this, but by my own personal experience, that God is real.
And let's talk about this, Jeff. The question was open-ended in a way that you asked, did you experience or have any awareness of God or a supreme being? And then you were asking the question kind of in the affirmative, did you get that information? But you also looked through the narrative responses and you said, did you get any response that God doesn't exist? Did you get any specific information telling you, no, there is no such thing as God? What was the answer to that question?
Sure. I considered it scientifically valid to word the survey question about whether they encountered God and a supreme being, to ask it in, if you will, a binary fashion. In other words, did you get information that God or a supreme being does exist, or did you get information that God or a supreme being does not exist? Either one of those circumstances should have resulted in an affirmative yes to that question. That's why the narrative response that followed that question was so critical. You could read that and find out what exactly they were thinking. Out of hundreds and hundreds of people that responded to that survey question, I can't think of a single one that said, gee, during my near-death experience, I encountered information that God or a supreme being does not exist. Essentially, every single person that checked that survey question yes was communicating, yes, I encountered right during my near-death experience. And again, that's important. Not what they believed before or thought below their near-death experience or what they thought or learned after their near-death experience. This is information learned during their near-death experience. And that information, over and over again, hundreds of people sharing, yes, I found evidence that God exists in my own near-death experience.
Personal note here, because I think a lot of people are like me in the way that this love thing is hard. I mean, I don't know why it's hard, but especially for guys and the way we're raised and conditioned.
Yeah.
So I want to emphasize your data, because some of us need the data to actually open us up to the reality of this and take it in more seriously. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, as a researcher, I'm data-driven. I really like to see the evidence behind it, and that has to have data that underlies it before I really accept it as being evidence for any particular point I'm trying to make in my near-death experience research. And so that's why this evidence about love is so interesting. I mean, here we have over 58% of people that had a near-death experience saying they encountered specific information or awareness about love in their near-death experience. Very exciting finding. Very much tells us that that's a very critical, important, very common part of a near-death experience that shockingly people just haven't asked that much for. And yet, for the near-death experiencers themselves, very often they'll share it's among the most important awareness they have during their near-death experience.
Jeff, let's talk about religion, because we've sprinkled some little pieces of that in here. This is not a religious book. As a matter of fact, for some religious people, some of the information that you found they'll find very shocking and in some cases probably unsettling. Tell us how you approached the religious question, how you probed it, and what you discovered.
Yeah, when I was writing that book, I was very clear that this was information that addressed many people's diverse religious beliefs. So how was I able to do the research and then write a book on that? One word: courage. I was so committed to knowing the truth about near-death experiences and so committed to sharing that reality with the world that I was committed that whatever I found in my research, I was going to share with the world. And that's exactly what I did. And remarkably, that book has been very well received. I mean, when we talk about God in this book, the great majority of people, including huge talks with huge numbers of people at two different churches, one liberal, one conservative, were fascinated. They loved it. I mean, we had questions going on for about an hour at both churches. God in near-death experiences, the concepts of love, some of the spiritual information in near-death experiences seems to really touch a chord with everybody, whatever their prior religious belief would be. I think now more than ever, people are open to that, they're interested in that, and I think they're especially interested when the news is so profoundly good, as I discovered in my research.
And I think there's a tandem question that goes with this from your survey that in a way is so stunning that it's almost easy to gloss over. And you asked people who experienced God or some kind of supreme being or just that sense that this is the big thing out there. You asked them about the reality of that experience. And the stat that you got back I thought was stunning. 96.2% of people said that was definitely real. 20 years later, that was definitely real.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Those are the group of people that encountered God. And I think you and I and perhaps a lot of others would say, well, how sure are they? Are they sure their near-death experience was real? With their near-death experience, including an awareness or encounter with God, how sure are they about that anyway? Amazingly, and I asked that question directly, how do you consider the reality of your experience at the current time? 96.2% of those who encountered God out of 4 different possibilities picked the highest level of certainty. That's saying they believed that their experience, their near-death experience, was definitely real.
And compare that. I mean, and I'm sure this data is out there, I don't have it on my fingertips. Any of us, if you just ask me about some experience I had 20 years ago, there's many of them I would say I'm not kind of totally sure. I mean, let's put this in perspective in terms of the how big of a percentage this is.
Yeah, I mean, that's just an amazing percentage. For somebody who has such an unearthly experience and encounters God as part of a profoundly unearthly experience, unlike anything they've had in their life, for 96.2 people to come back and say it's definitely real is a profound message. That really shows how confident they are that what they encountered was real. And that's not surprising because you see huge changes in these people's lives. People don't change their lives radically unless they have a very strong reason to change. And for these near-death experiencers by the hundreds, and actually in my research database by the thousands, they've had their near-death experience. Virtually all of them know that it absolutely was real. And of course, not surprisingly, they go on to make huge changes in response to what they learned during their near-death experience.
Here's the question, I guess. Cynical people, if they're clever, can turn any issue into a mud fight. And we see that every time we turn on the news. Science is no different, and it muddies the water. It makes it hard for people to understand. Why is science attacking this? What is at stake for science with near-death experience research that they're so afraid of?
Yeah. I think the concept of near-death experiences that we're much more than our physical brain, that there really is a immaterial part of us that survives bodily death, is so radically different from what mainstream science believes and has taught for literally for centuries, that I think near-death experience evidence is such a huge paradigm shift that it's unfamiliar, certainly, to a lot of scientists. It is certainly disconcerting to them when it flies in the face of everything that they've ever believed or even taught in the classroom for years or decades. And so I think that there's a lot of scientists that in the mainstream that will just simply instinctively assume that it cannot be true and only seek out the evidence that will help justify their beliefs. I think when you see the mainstream scientists push back on near-death experience and startlingly ignore some of the profoundly strong evidence that near-death experience is for real, certainly reminds me as a researcher, unlike those types of scientists, we have to be, if anything, more open-minded than ever. We have to carefully study their arguments, study the concerns about the reality of near-death experience, and only after we've carefully considered the alternative explanations, if they've been found to be wanting, if they alternative, if you will, skeptical explanations don't explain near-death experience, then and only then do I go confidently before the world and say near-death experiences are real. And I've walked that journey. I've looked over every single argument against near-death experience that I can find. And by the way, there's over 20 of them. Over the years, and seemingly every year or two, some new skeptical alternative explanation of near-death experience comes along. And the reason that there's that many of these alternative explanations is very simple. And that is there's no one or several alternative explanations of near-death experience that make sense even to mainstream scientists.
Yet we cannot overemphasize the extent to which this conflicts with the existing paradigm. I mean, we hear about the hard problem of consciousness. This totally throws that out the window. Hey, take the easy problem of consciousness. What they say is the easy problem of consciousness, which is, we understand how vision works. We understand how hearing works. Really? Here are people that don't have a brain, don't have a visual cortex, don't have any hearing eardrums, and they're hearing, they're seeing. I mean, we cannot overemphasize what a huge paradigm shift this is. And yet sometimes we do. I think even near-death experience researchers want to take their foot off the gas pedal a little bit and kind of pretend like, this doesn't completely overturn science. But it does, doesn't it?
I think it really does. I think when you have the evidence that is so powerful, and by the way, I've had a lot of people share their near-death experiences that were skeptical scientists at the time they had their near-death experience. And I will here to tell you, a near-death experience cures near-death experience disbelief. Whether you're a doctor, scientist, whatever your prior belief about near-death experience, once you've had one, almost uniformly it's real. But, it's certainly... It's true in mainstream science, to have evidence like this is very difficult. I think what I've seen from mainstream scientists that are attacking near-death experiences are, in general, they raise hypotheses. Brain electrical activity, brain chemistry, fragments of memory. I mean, there's all these hypotheses about why near-death experiences could occur, but almost never will you find a person who's attacking near-death experience who does it at the level of the kind of evidence we're talking about here. Near-death experiences in those born totally blind, near-death experiences in general anesthesia, the strikingly accurate out-of-body observations that occur in near-death experiences, even far from the physical body and far outside of any physical sensory awareness. This is the kind of evidence that makes mainstream scientists attacking near-death experience very uncomfortable, and in general, you're not going to hear them address it.
And Jeff, it even makes people uncomfortable who have crossed over to the other side, because you're also suggesting a hierarchy of consciousness. So if I'm a philosopher and I'm cutting edge consciousness guy and I'm willing to say, okay, everything is consciousness, everything is quantum mind, everything I could possibly experience emerges out of the same stuff, it's all consciousness. Hey, you know what? You come along And your findings seem to conflict with that too. This idealism idea, because you're saying that you're finding an order and a hierarchy to consciousness. Here are dead relatives who you know have been followed. Not only did you know them when you were alive, but they've been following you and they can tell you what's going on in your life. Here are spirits and angels who say, I'm at this level, but there's other levels above me. And people even have a personal experience with, hey, and then I met some being and they were at a higher level.
Yeah,
what does this say about the hierarchy of consciousness, and what does that do to folks who just want to have this kind of consciousness blob out there?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. A lot of near-death experience seems to point to, if you will, a collective consciousness. For example, when you have a life review, sometimes you not only are aware of your own prior life, but you may be aware of what the other person you interacted with felt like, whether for good or for ill. And that certainly is one of the many lines of that all converge on the fact that there seems to be, if you will, in this universe, a kind of a collective, unified consciousness. And you're right, there seems to be that hierarchy. In other words, when you encounter someone in the unearthly realms of a near-death experience, they may talk about, somebody who's sort of a seemingly higher, used in the broadest term, spiritual being, or certainly someone that they will go talk to or get some insights or some wisdom about dealing with a situation during the near-death experience. And of course, that ultimate supreme consciousness being God, no question there's that hierarchy. That kind of is very difficult for mainstream science to handle, and you can understand that I almost
it's even difficult for frontier science to handle. Yeah. I guess that's my point. I mean, you go into the parapsychology community, or you go into people who are looking at consciousness in general, they can even get to the point of dealing with consciousness being fundamental, consciousness being everything. But when you start introducing the idea that there might be some order, some structure, some hierarchy to it, they vapor up, man. It's like, no, don't bring that into it.
Yeah, and again, I'm not, when we talk about this and a hierarchy of consciousness, this isn't something that is speculation. This isn't something we're doing that's wishful thinking. This is based on evidence that being very consistently observed, many, many observations. And you're back to that fundamental scientific principle. If it's real, it's going to be consistently observed. And that's exactly what we're seeing here, sort of that hierarchy of consciousness consistently observed in a vast number of near-death experiences.
Here's the question and here's the issue. I return then to your findings, and I find something different when I look at the near-death experiences. I see some similarities, but I also see some differences. The question is, what do you think near-death experience science can offer us as a way of looking at and understanding these extended consciousness realities?
Yeah, I think the most direct response to your question would be what one near-death experiencer shared. She was in these unearthly, you could call it heavenly afterlife during her near-death experience, overwhelming feelings of love and peace. And here in this near-death experience was God. And for the first time, this near-death experiencer, in a near-death experience, asked God directly, why me? Why was I allowed to have this happen to me, that being this incredibly beautiful near-death experience? I think God's answer was very meaningful and directly relevant to this question. God answered that near-death experiencer, love falls on everyone equally. This is what you needed to live your earthly life. So I think as you start thinking about consciousness, you need to be aware that there's sort of a supreme consciousness. There's an order and a purpose in the universe. I think it's certainly here on Earth is probably some of the lower level. The consciousness and alertness we encounter in near-death experience is off the scale in terms of what we're aware of in our earthly lives. You could have a life review in a near-death experience and encounter decades of your prior life in what would literally be less than a minute seeming of time in a near-death experience. So I think as you study near-death experiences, you have that rather exciting and rather startling awareness that there's that frontier out there, consciousness, sort of a unified consciousness, an order and purpose in the universe, and a purpose of, that's led to us being here in our earthly life that is I think has been amazing to me as I've done the research and found that, and certainly amazing to people that have read my book and have studied this in their own way. And hopefully we're right at the frontier where more and more people are going to learn about this with further research, because I think that kind of knowledge could change the world.
By now, you must know that there is a God, who is the creator of all things. It has already been proven to you. If not, go back and see DVDs 1 and 2 again. Now, for a recap of what was said at the beginning of this DVD 2.
For instance, let's take a hypothetical scenario. Let's say, just as a hypothetical, that God is real. Let's say that God created the world, He gave us rules to live by, and that we're going to be judged according to those rules in the afterlife based on how we lived while we're living. So if this scenario were true, we can do what makes us feel good. But if it's not in accordance with the rules, then we're still going to be judged according to those rules. So as you can see, when it comes to something that's important, sometimes it doesn't matter what makes us feel good. What really matters is what the truth actually is, whether we like it or not. And so I've heard people say before, well, I decide where I'm going to go. I control where I'm going to go when I die. I'm going to heaven, or wherever. But here's the flaw with that one. If you do have a soul, can you control where your soul goes right now? Can you make it leave your body right now? You see, the problem is, if you can't control where your soul goes right now, what makes you think you can control where it goes in the afterlife? And so you don't hear people talk about this next point, probably because no one has a good answer or they haven't ever thought about it. But let's just look at the facts. No one knows for sure what's going to happen in the afterlife until we get there. We can have faith, belief, and conviction about it, but we don't know for sure what's going to happen. And here's proof of that. Between the major different religions and the different denominations of each of those religions, there are literally over 10,000 different religions that all say theirs is the only true religion. Well, there's a real problem in the world then, isn't there? Because there are 6.9 billion people in the world today, and even if the biggest religion is correct, the biggest one, which would be the Roman Catholic Church, then that would mean 83% of the world is wrong. 83%! And that's just the biggest one. If you look at most groups of religions, that number increases exponentially. With most religions out there, if they were the true one, that would mean the other 99% of the world is wrong. So here's the problem we're left with. People have conviction. They have belief about what's going to happen in the afterlife. Many people are willing to die for it, or even sometimes kill for their religion. But the fact of the matter is, everybody thinks they're right. But with most of the religions out there, there's over a 99% chance that they're wrong. It has to be that way. Do the math. There's no other way. So my point in telling you this is just to make you aware that there's a very real confusion in the world today. And by definition, no matter how they feel about it, most of the world has to be wrong.
With these DVDs, we are searching for the truth and reality of this life, and we let the chips fall where they may. Are you sincerely searching for the truth? Do you really want to know who this God is? If so, continue on to DVD 3 for the answer.